Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about adaptation, and in particular, the adaptation of the Wheel of Time, the entire 14-book series plus the one-book prequel into the Wheel of Time TV show. And the reason I want to discuss this is there are actually a couple of different ways to think about adaptation. And I know the most natural way that we all sort of immediately is our go-to is here's a book, here are the scenes in the book, film the scenes and put them on the screen. Like, what's the big deal? Why are people changing things? And for certain types of narrative, that can work very well. And in fact, Zack Snyder's Watchmen, it took a graphic novel, it used a lot of the panels of that graphic novel as a way to storyboard the film version. It is one of the closest page to screen adaptations that I think you can have. But the difficulty with that is the written medium, particularly long novels, do not naturally lend themselves to a literal page to screen adaptation, because books rely a lot on description, exposition, internal monologue, a lot of backstory being filled in ways that were you to film it as a scene would seem very unnatural. It wouldn't fit with the paradigm that we have for the visual and auditory sort of process that television or even film are, because the reading experience is actually very, very different to the viewing experience. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. Just because someone is not doing the literal page to screen adaptation does not imply that they are being disrespectful to the source material. And I'm going to go through some of the reasons for this. I'm going to try and show you this, because it's all well and good me saying this, but that's not particularly convincing unless you can kind of visualize it and see what I'm talking about. So hopefully this has worked and it's up on screen. If not, I will try to find the visual and put it in. But what I've done here is I've put the 14 novels of the Wheel of Time. And yes, I do know there's a prequel novel. The prequel novel is a prequel and not part of the main Wheel of Time sequence. It is a prequel. There's additional material from that is obviously going to lend itself, is lore that is going to be incorporated and has already been referred to in some of the episodes. But they are adapting the 14-book series. And what we've been told is they are getting 8 seasons of 8 episodes each. So I've put in the 8 seasons with all of the episodes numbered. And simple mathematics shows you cannot have 1 season per book. It doesn't work. You would end up, running out after Path of Daggers, right? So you can't do 1 season to 1 book. That is already not an option that the showrunners have. They didn't choose this. This is the format that they had to work with. Now, I believe in a number of episodes or a number of interviews, the showrunner has said that yes, they asked for more episodes, they asked for additional things, but this is what they were given, this is what they were told they had to conform to, this is what they have to work with. And it would be very unprofessional for a showrunner to go, right, I'm going to start with the premise that we're going to get it, but at some point they're going to give me more, so I'll just plan on getting up to Path of Daggers, and then if we don't finish by then the studio will just have to give us more. You have to see that if you've been told this is your format, you have to construct your entire narrative to fit that format. Otherwise, you're not being a professional. So that's the first thing to consider. You cannot do a literal page to screen translation of the text because it doesn't fit in the format. The formatting is completely different. So that's the first thing to realize. Now, let's think about this conceptually. If you're adapting from the eye of the world to the end of Memory of Light, that is one giant narrative. So don't think about it, and this is actually quite difficult for those of us who have read the books, but don't think about it as season 1, book 1, season 2, book 2, and book 3, season 3, book 3, and book 4. Think about it more. We are running from the eye of the world to a memory of light in 8 installments. And those 8 installments are being subdivided into 8 chapters. So the entire story is essentially 64 chapters with 8 sort of mini books. So that is completely changing the pacing and the structure and the narrative structure of what is going on in the entire show. It cannot conform to the books. It just can't. There's no way to break up the scenes in such a way as to fit this new format and still have it make any sort of cohesive sense. So that means one of the things that you kind of have to do is you look at, and I've talked about this before, about kernels and satellites. What is the through line? What are the key narrative events that must occur? What is then, in terms of story, what is the chronology of those key events? And then plot, how are we going to show those key events in what order? And what, like, one of the key examples that we've already seen in season 1 is they didn't go to Cairherne. They didn't meet Elaine. And you go, but that was in the Eye of the World. That's very important. But was it important for the story of the Eye of the World? No, it's much more important from the Great Hunt onwards. So if you take that sequence out, because it's not important for the key aspects that you are telling for the initial 8 chapters of the story of the Wheel of Time over these 14 books, but over these 8 seasons. If you take that sequence out, what have you changed? And in that, you know, obviously there's an element of Rand and Matt and the interactions going on, the interactions with the Inn, the meeting of Loyal, all of those things, which are important to the Eye of the World, but they are now removed. So how can we add back in the essence of those things? Well, when they go to Tar Valon, when they go to Tar Valon, they go to another inn there. Well, there's a similar sort of setting. We'll move the meeting of Elaine to later on, to the second season. We'll have some of those interactions happening there. And the same key narrative kernel, the same aspect of it is happening. There's the introduction to Loyal, there's the development of the relationship between Matt and Rand, and stuff developing there. And you go, is it perfect? No, but they're trying to keep to the key essence of what is important when you only have 8 episodes to tell that story. So it's not about looking at, I'm keeping this scene. It's what happens in these scenes, what is being told, what is the story underlying everything, and then trying to find a way to frame it. Now, because that scene has been removed, and because you've now changed the scene in Tar Valon, you need to rewrite it so that it makes sense with that omission now, which means you rewrite the scene. It's not going to be the same as any of the scenes in the book. And you go, okay, it's not that the showrunners believe that they can write a better story than Robert Jordan. If Robert Jordan were still alive, it would be brilliant if he could rewrite the entirety of the Wheel of Time to an 8-season, 8-episode breakdown, because then he could rewrite all of the scenes and he could restructure the entire 14-book narrative into an 8-season show that is subdivided into 64 episodes. And we'd all be happy with that. But that's not an option to us. That's not an option open to the showrunners. So here's the next point. When we're establishing this whole thing, if we think of season 1 as essentially the introduction of one big book, this is now not, don't think of the 14 books of the Wheel of Time series. Think of the Wheel of Time as a single story, a single narrative, a single book. And it has 64 chapters. And the first 8 chapters form part 1 of the Wheel of Time. And you go, what are the essential elements that I need in part 1 to tell the entirety of the story? You go, one of the key elements, for instance, is the warder bond with the Aes Sedai. It's so important to the relationship with Lan and Moiraine and what happens with Rand later on. it is incredibly important for a viewer to actually understand that. Now, one of the options that you have is you can have one character say to another character, well, warders have a really strong bond with their Aes Sedai, and it's really strong. And you can tell the viewer that. But that lacks resonance. It lacks emotional connection. A different way of doing it is look at some of the key scenes that occur in, say, the first 5 books, where we see examples of the warder bond. How can we demonstrate this? How can we show this to the audience? And one of the best ways of doing that is to show what happens to a warder when their Aes Sedai dies. And lo and behold, that's the route that the showrunners took, because they're establishing this thing. Because if they establish it now, it means they don't need to devote multiple scenes to slowly developing the audience's understanding of this very key, very important aspect of the story. They do it now so that for the next 7 seasons following this one, they can just refer to it and everyone will understand what it is. But because you've taken scenes and information from different places in all of these different novels, clearly no one of those scenes is going to convey everything you need and in the context of much earlier in the story. So you take all of those elements and you write a sequence of scenes that show the audience all of the key aspects. Because in that episode, we saw the complexity of the bond of brotherhood between the warders. We saw the depth of the warder bond with the Aes Sedai. We saw how devastating it was to lose that bond. We understand the emotional feedback loop between the warder and the Aes Sedai in both directions. All of those things are very powerfully communicated, and it was done in a very dramatic and powerful episode. Was it literally true to any scene of the books? No, it wasn't. But what was being communicated is the essence of so many of those warder scenes, so many of those discussions between various characters trying to describe the warder bond, and also those scenes where we as readers got in through the exposition to actually understand what was going on. That was visually represented on the screen. Any viewer now understands the depth of that bond. They can feel it. They saw it. They saw that connection. So now, for the rest of the next 7 seasons, when they talk about the warder bond, the viewer knows that's what it is. They understand it. Now, I know there was criticism. Why do it with Steppen? Why do it with this Aes Sedai that has nothing to do? They could have done it later on, but they needed to do it early. So they could have chosen an Aes Sedai and warder issue that happens much later on in the books, but that would have changed a significant development later on in the books. So what they did was they took a warder and Aes Sedai story from the lore and incorporated it into that thing so it wouldn't disrupt the future narrative, was still being true to the ethos and lore of the world, even if sequentially and chronologically it was out of sequence. It doesn't fit with the order that we would have gotten it in the books. But you can see they are trying in their minds, whether or not you believe this is the best way to go about it, but they are trying in their minds to be very faithful to the lore of the world without being literal. And this is one of these big distinctions. So when I talk about why you thinking about it as a meta narrative over 14 novels, this is an illustration of why. Because here we have The Eye of the World, it's a prologue, and then 53 chapters. And as you read The Eye of the World, there's going to be rising and falling action. There's going to be instigating events. There's going to be different challenges for different heroes and different characters through it. That is how the novel is structured. But when we think of the Wheel of Time TV show, and we go, right, we're opening this in a meta narrative to deal with the whole of the 14 books. Obviously, you can't translate 53 chapters of a novel into 8. It's not even, 3 chapters per episode. you can see that it doesn't neatly fit. There's no easy way to cram that information in. So because of that, you have to excise information. You have to excise stuff from chapters. If you excise stuff from chapters, then that information has to be fitted in somewhere and somehow, which means you alter further scenes to incorporate that information, or you find other ways to incorporate that information somewhere else, which means later scenes that rely on those earlier scenes might need to be rewritten. Or you can create a brand new scene or a brand new sequence of scenes that sort of consolidate information from all of those sections that you had to chop out because the narrative doesn't fit. And you create a brand new sequence that is true in spirit to the story that is being told, the kernels of what is being told, the through line of the narrative. And that is why quite often when we get an episode that you go, but there were very few elements of this particular episode that seemed directly drawn from the book. Why aren't they staying true to the book? And this is one of the reasons why. They're not doing a literal adaptation of The Eye of the World, the book. They are doing an adaptation of The Wheel of Time, which is 14 books long. And when we think of the sort of the tension and rise of tension that you have in a TV season, you have your mid-season, your rise to the mid-season finale, then a dip again, and then the rise to the end of season finale. And, you know, I've demonstrated that here. But that's not how the Eye of the World is structured. That's not even close to how the Eye of the World is structured. None of that makes sense. So if you just took a whole load of the scenes as they were in the Eye of the World and jammed them into the Wheel of Time TV show, you would suddenly not have that rise in dramatic tension, the drop off, and then the rise in dramatic tension again. You would have a completely different narrative structure, and one that would be all over the place, and people would be complaining about the really weird, strange pacing and all of these things all over the place. It wouldn't be seamless. It wouldn't be a smooth narrative construction because the plot structure just wouldn't fit. So again, it's not necessarily that the showrunners are thinking that they can do better than Jordan. It's you're taking source material that has a completely different structure and you're trying to restructure it to fit what is going on, and also in a different format with different expectations. As a book reader, authors quite often rely on the fact that we are very willing, particularly epic fantasy readers, we are very willing to read through a couple of 100 pages to slowly have the world explained to us and to slowly grasp what's going on. TV shows, on the other hand, are reliant on people sort of tuning in. And if they get bored, they're not going to tune back in again. They're not going to make that investment where you go, oh, it really picks up in season 4. So you need to watch the first 3 seasons. Very few people are swayed by that logic. They go, if I'm not interested in the first couple of episodes, I'm not watching the rest of it. So you change the narrative structure, you change the pacing, you change the elements of where action is fitting in, and you try to have, even within an episode, elements of rising and falling action, building towards dramatic moments. And quite often those occur at the end of an episode. So you take that little structure that I have on the screen and you can actually put it in as, for every single episode, that slow sort of structure built into every single episode and then building up over the season. And you can see why structurally you can't do a page to screen adaptation. You have to change things. And when you change things, you have to understand the repercussions of what you change and then see ways to, now that you've removed those elements, what do you have to add back in to make it make sense? So you can see what I've tried to get across here is that instead of thinking of it as a book to screen adaptation and getting upset that, well, now they're not doing stuff from the books, how is this an adaptation? That instead of looking at it as a book to screen, think of it as the entirety of the Wheel of Time being adapted to the screen. And when we think of that overall arc, that it's a story built across an entire series, that's what's being adapted, not the individual books. that helps us get a different framework for appreciating how and why the showrunners are adapting it the way that they do. And when we think of key points of world building that are developed over multiple books for book readers, TV audiences might need that information a lot faster, and they might need it more directly. And because that isn't in the books, because there's no scene in the books that does that, you have to create a scene to communicate that information. And if you create that scene, that is going to obviously take away from a scene that was in the books that isn't being adapted. But that's not because the showrunners think that they can do it better than Robert Jordan. Unfortunately, Robert Jordan isn't with us anymore. Otherwise, maybe he could do it. And he would be writing these scenes. And that would reassure, I think, a lot of people if Robert Jordan were still alive, if he was signing off on this. And every episode was like, he was right up there going, I was the lead writer. I signed off on this. This is my vision. And I understand what they're trying to do with a new structure for a different medium, for a different audience. Then, when we also consider internal monologues and long passages of introspection and long passages of description and all of those sorts of sequences, that's not really how TV works. TV works in terms of dialogue, in terms of dramatic scenes and characters talking. And if you just stripped away all of the internal monologue, all of the passages of description, all of those sorts of things, and you just took all the dialogue from the books and put it on screen, it wouldn't work, because that exposition, that the prose that Jordan uses to evoke the world and to tell the reader about things is so integral to the storytelling of the novels. But there isn't an easy way to put that on the screen, because the screen relies so heavily on dynamic action sequences and dynamic dramatic sequences where characters are talking. It's all about dialogue. So when you have large sections in an epic fantasy novel, and let's face it, Robert Jordan, like a lot of epic fantasy authors, was fond of long sections of exposition and introspection and stuff that we love as readers. It wasn't all just characters talking and characters doing something and then talking. There were long passages and delving into these intricate aspects of the world. In order to evoke that on the screen, you have to think of a way to do it, and you can't always do that in the way that it is done in the books. You have to pay attention to the new medium, the new audience, and the new narrative structure. So in order to do that, you might have to craft an entirely new scene to give that information to the viewer. If you do that, that has to fit with the other scenes that are going on, because the eye of the world may not have contained those things. Therefore, you have to insert brand new information, because it's necessary for the story for non-book readers. And another aspect of this is you have to conflate certain scenes to establish the baseline for non-book readers. Because while we love saying, oh, Rand and Matt go to this village, then Rand and Matt go to that farmhouse, then Rand and Matt go to Cairherne, and then Rand and Matt go to Tarvalin. Right. That's a whole sequence of Rand and Matt basically going to places. Instead of showing it 6 times, let's show it twice. Because for a viewer, that might be relatively repetitive. So instead of it being repetitive, you conflate the scenes. If you conflate the scenes, that means, yes, indeed, aspects of the book are not going to be shown. So those things that get cut out, when those sequences and those scenes are removed or those characters are removed, how does that change the overall arc of the Wheel of Time? Where can that information be reinserted? So now we get to this whole thing of scenes that have to be rewritten. And it could be a scene from the book that has to be restructured slightly to fit the new narrative paradigm. Or it might be that there isn't a scene from the book that is now going to provide the dramatic function necessary and the narrative function necessary for this part of a season, because it's only 8 episodes and it has to conform to a certain narrative structure. Therefore, they have to rewrite a lot of it. And that ensures that the overall arc that's being created actually is smoother and it fits, and that the entire story is being told. And I know for some people, this is not a form of adaptation they want, and it is perfectly fine not to enjoy this. But I would say that this is a very valid form of adaptation. It's a very practical form of adaptation to try to deliver not only something that is true to the essence of the books as the showrunners see it. And remember, all readers have their own perception of the story. How I read The Wheel of Time is not necessarily the same as how you read The Wheel of Time, is not necessarily the same as how your best friend read The Wheel of Time. We all pick up on different elements. We all interpret it differently. And the showrunners have read the entire thing. They've tried to see a through line from start to finish. They have tried to resequence the entirety of a 14-book series into 8 seasons and subdivide those 8 seasons into 8 episodes to provide a viewing experience, not a reading experience, for a general audience and not just an audience of epic fantasy readers. So you can see there are a lot of changes. And just because those changes do not match what is in the book or are not how we personally may want them, does not mean that the showrunners are being disrespectful. It does not mean that the showrunners are ignoring what is in the book. It is an interpretation of the entire sequence to try to tell it in a seamless and cohesive way. So while I understand that, you know, we can watch that first season of The Wheel of Time and go, this isn't how I do it, or they're not staying true to the eye of the world, or why are they adding in all of this different material? One of the things that makes it easier for me to enjoy the TV show as distinct to The Wheel of Time, the book series, is remembering that this is the first section of an 8-section narrative. This is literally the opening of a book. These 8 episodes are the foundation for an 8-section story, and we're only getting the first bit. And I know that a lot of us get very upset when things are not true to a scene from, say, The Eye of the World. And yeah, that can be very difficult. But they're not adapting The Eye of the World. That is not what season 1 is. Not The Eye of the World. Season 1 is the start of The Wheel of Time. And when we think about it from that perspective, regardless of whether or not that's what we want or that's how we want to think about it, I think we honestly have to admit that that is a valid way to do it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are disrespecting the material. And the same goes for, say, the development of representation of LGBTQ in the series. There have been comments online about, oh, this is a woke social justice warrior agenda or blah, 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 whatever. But Robert Jordan had reference to pillow friends all the way through the series. Now, when he wrote it, it was unfortunate that a lot of those references felt very much like, oh, well, they were in college and they just tried something out. But we're in the modern day now. We don't have to be coy about these things. It is in the text. There's no problem with adapting it from the text and putting it front and center. That's part of the lore of the world from one interpretation. And it might not be your interpretation of what a pillow friend is. Okay. But you still have to admit that the pillow friend thing exists. It is part of the lore of the world. And you can, if you so choose, read it in light of, no, these are genuine homosexual lesbian relationships. And yeah, we're adapting it for the modern day because it's not the 1990s anymore. So that's one aspect. We talk about how aspects of the show, oh, they were focusing on this thing and they haven't focused on Rand yet. This is a big thing that I know is going around and being debated because we're still only on what I think episode 6. Well, Rand has been present in all of the episodes. And if you notice, a lot of the earlier episodes, did have him quite central to a lot of the shots. He was always there with reactions. He was the one who initially stood up to Moraine. But then they're introducing and trying to focus each episode on one of the other characters to give them their moment to sort of shine and be central. Because let's face it, a lot of the rest of the series is going to put Rand front and center. Do you just do that from the very beginning and go, have everyone have all of the viewers just think of all of the other characters as side characters who aren't important? Can you just get back to Rand's storyline? No, you want to try and create an ensemble cast. You want to try and create interest in all of the different story threads, the way that Jordan did. But in order to do that for a TV audience, you have to give them a reason to buy into it, because you don't have the leisure and the time that you have in a novel to have these long digressions to get to know characters. And we might very well go, oh, but it'd be so much better if we had 14 episodes a season or 22 episodes a season. You go, yeah, it would be better, but we don't. We have 8. So what do? Oh, well, they should have just asked for more. You go, yeah, I want a pony. I'm not getting a pony. I work with what I have. Can you see, just because we want more, just because we think it would be better if they'd had more, if they'd had a bigger budget, they should have had a bigger budget. You go, but that wasn't what they had. They had a budget of a certain level. They did the best that they could. Not only that, but they also had a whole COVID epidemic in the middle of it. There's an entire pandemic which has affected everything. And also, one of the central characters left. One of the actors left and had to be recast for the second season, which will have an effect on how that character is introduced and whether or not you want audiences to really bond with that actor and that character in that way when you're going to recast them. So you might have gone back and edited certain of these sequences and episodes to remove some of the focus on that, just so you could reintroduce the character later on and develop their arc more fully then. Like, these are all practical considerations that go into adaptation, because it's not just a theoretical, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could? There are practical realities about the number of actors that you can have, the amount of money you have for costuming and sets and shooting on location and the expense of that. All of these things play into it. And, people can say, oh, well, I still don't like it. And that's absolutely fine. No one's saying you have to like it. But it's not that the showrunners are going, we don't care about the source material. If you want to see showrunners that don't care about the source material, go and have a look at Legend of the Seeker, because that in no way is a true adaptation of the books. Regardless of how you feel about the books and regardless of how you feel about the show, it is not in any way a true adaptation or a good adaptation of Terry Goodkin's novels. It doesn't stay true to the ethos of the books. It doesn't stay true to the storyline of the books. It doesn't stay true to the characters of the books. And when you compare like for like this is one of those shows that was a big show in its day. Look at the quality comparing the two. That had a cast of about 4 central people and then extras and guest stars. That was it. Whereas look at the cast and the size of The Wheel of Time. You go, a lot of money has been spent on this. Do you want it to look like a HBO film, like Zack Snyder's Justice League? That requires a budget significantly larger and was for a lot less screen time, where your budget didn't have to stretch as far. All of these are practical considerations in adaptation. But I think the big one for this is the narrative structure for 8 seasons being broken into 8 episodes is so radically different from a 14-book series that you have to look at the entire arc of the 14 books and then restructure that absolutely to try and fit 8 seasons. And that means moving a lot of stuff around. And as soon as you start moving things, as soon as you conflate certain things, you then have to add in different things so that the new scenes make sense and line up, because you can't have all of those sequences. It's impossible. But you can't just remove sequences and think it's going to to line up. You remove huge chunks because you're essentially having the amount of time, at least having the amount of time that you have to tell the whole story. So half the material has to go. If you cut away half of the wheel of time, how do you make what is left make sense? So you cut away slightly more than half so you can build in specific things so that now it smooths out and lines up far more seamlessly. But this is just my interpretation of it. This is just one way to adapt a TV show. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for your continuing support, and I'll see you in the next one.